Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Donna Rapiccioli, and I serve as the Dean of the Gabelli School of Business. It's truly my pleasure to welcome everyone to the second Gabelli Forward event. Gabelli Forward is a webinar series designed to highlight the work of Gabelli School faculty in research, teaching, university service, and community engagement. Today, we're going to highlight the work of Professor Clarence E. Ball III, who serves in the area of communications and media management. He also serves as the Interim Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at the Gabelli School. For over the last 4 years, Clarence, myself, and our entire team have been partnering to drive our diversity initiatives. Today's event is an example of his creative approach to advancing our important work in this area. The conversation on anti-racism and allyship in the 21st century will be with an amazing and informed panel of Gabelli School alumni and senior executives from Fordham University. I have the honor of knowing many of them for a very long time. So it truly is my pleasure to introduce the panelists. Mandel Crawley is a GSB MBA alum, executive MBA of '09, and he's currently the head of private wealth management for Morgan Stanley. Welcome, Mandel. It's great to see you.
Hey, Dean, how are you? Good to see you.
I'm excellent. I'm so glad that you're here. Bliss Griffin is an MBA alum of 2019, and she is the National Diversity and Inclusion Strategist for the Actors Equity Association. She's also studying law at Fordham University School of Law. Dr. Ashley Davis is the supervising psychologist and coordinator for diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice initiatives here at Fordham. Leslie Messiah Arthur is associate vice president and special assistant to the president for government relations here at Fordham. And finally, Kareem Peet is the Title IX director for Fordham University. I want to welcome all of you, and I am so grateful that you're taking the time to have this conversation. And now I will turn it over to Clarence Ball to begin the discussion.
Very good. Thank you, Dean Rapiccioli, for your thoughtful welcome and for your continued support of our diversity initiative. I'd be remiss if I didn't use this opportunity as a diversity practitioner to say that having an executive leader like Dean Rapiccioli really makes me feel like we're making a difference, not only at the Gabelli School, but also in the Bronx and around the world. This event, it was really a collaborative effort, and I'd like to personally thank the Gabelli Forward team by starting with Travis Russ, the Associate Dean of the Graduate School, Lawrence Murray, the Senior Assistant Dean for the Graduate Admissions, Rachel Dawkins, Senior Assistant Dean for Graduate Studies, Bob Daly, the Assistant Dean for the Bachelor's of Science in Global Business, and of course, Jenna Gambino from the Marketing Department. Our topic today is anti-racism and allyship in the 21st century, and we are approaching this topic with a few predetermined topics, some open discussion, and we'll also be fielding questions from the audience. So please feel free to use the question and answer feature for Zoom so that we can field your questions. That said, I'd like to dive very quickly in here because we've got much to discuss. So our first speaker is Bliss Griffin, all right? Bliss, do you mind sharing your screen for the slide deck, please? And how have you been, Bliss? It's so good to see you again. Bliss was go ahead.
I'm good. I'm busy responding on behalf of Actors Equity and leading the organization in its response to the current moment. So busy and happy to be responding to that call to action.
Very good. So let's see here. Bliss was actually on the DEI team at GSB, and during her tenure here, so much of what we're still doing at the Gabelli School, really, she helped to build and design. So Bliss, could you please share a few quick highlights of your career, and then I'm going to start with the first question.
Sure. I was every great big nerdy theater kid stereotype growing up, and I earned a BFA in acting from the University of Miami, and I was an actor for the first 10 years of my career. A lot of Shakespeare mostly, and a lot of small cast dramas, and I found during that time that a lot of the systemic inequities in the world around us are amplified in the theater industry, and that many artists, regardless of their demographics, are taken advantage of in their employment relationships. And I decided that it was time for me to take all that I had learned as an artist and transition that into a career that uplifted the industry that I love so much by helping it to be more inclusive and helping it to be a better steward of the lives of its practitioners. So went to Gabelli, got an MBA in management. I learned so many things. I'm very, very grateful for my time there. And as I was exiting Gabelli, I joined the Actors Equity Association as the lead for D&I projects. I had been a member of the union for the duration of my acting career. So I'm very grateful to combine that very relevant knowledge in terms of what our members face and experience every day with some business strategy and diversity and inclusion strategy. And while I was at Gabelli, I worked on some early projects with Clarence in terms of diversity and inclusion, including ground floor education for freshmen and implicit bias training for graduate faculty.
Very good. Thank you for sharing all of that. I remembered all of that, but they needed to hear it, right? So let's see here, all right? As a diversity practitioner, do you mind sharing your thoughts on the definition of the term racism, and then sharing with the audience how to deal with racism when they encounter it?
Ask me the biggest question in the world. I conceive of racism in three major areas. Most people think of interpersonal racism when they hear the word racism, either direct discrimination or violence or disdain for a person or a group of people based on their race. That's pretty easy to spot, even if it's finding its way through implicit bias and it's not intentional. There are a million ways to address it. The second category that I would identify is institutional racism. How has a single institution built its processes so that they are inaccessible and exclusionary to certain people based on their race? And then finally, I would identify systemic racism. The entire society that we live in has behavioral patterns, laws that exclude some people based on their race. They may not do that directly anymore, but they still have that outcome. In answer to the question, how do we deal with racism when we see it? That depends very much on which of those three forms you're identifying and what kind of relationship, what kind of power do you have? So most of my attention right now is focused on institutional racism. And we approach that by gaining buy-in from our highest leaders, right? Helping them to understand in a deeply personal way that racism exists in the organization and you probably have perpetuated it even without intending to. That doesn't make you a bad person. That makes you a human person that lives in the larger society. And then surveying, analyzing all of the systems through a particularly anti-racist lens so that we can identify where are the barriers to entry, where are the places that we're losing people of color in general, where are the places that we're losing Black people. Does that have just to do with our internal behaviors, or are we allowing the systemic racism outside of our doors to affect what's inside of it? And taking a steady, kind but firm, mission-driven approach to looking at every single vertical. Interpersonal racism is a little bit more difficult to address. And you have to take it on a case-by-case basis. How much emotional bandwidth do you have to address that? And are you talking to somebody that can actually hear you? And what are they going to hear? Are they going to be a person that hears your emotional appeal because they're tied to you? Or are they going to be a person that hears data? And that is understanding how to approach interpersonal racism is something that I would encourage everyone in the audience to spend their own time researching, figuring out, because there's so many variables involved that I can't give you a concise answer here, but the answers are simply a Google search away if you want to learn more about how people are interacting with racism.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bliss. I think that all of that is really true, particularly breaking racism up into those 3 different categories, because it helps us solve for each one prescriptively. So thank you. I'd like to go now to Leslie Messiah, author. Can you mind switching the next slide, please? So Leslie, so good to see you. If you live in the state of New York and you do not know Leslie, you should. She is one of the most powerful lobbyists in the state, particularly, I hear her scoffing, particularly in the higher education space, and she represents the university very well in Albany. Leslie, please share a few quick highlights with the audience from your career, and then I'll proceed with the next question.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having this conversation. I think it's very important that we all get together. Just in terms of a little bit about myself, I have a position which requires me to be in the background, right? So when I'm essentially an advocate, I'm a lobbyist, I represent the university, but through my position at Fordham, it has allowed me to be able to be involved in policy, legislative direction. So when I see things as one of the most powerful lobbyists in New York, I think my political science brain turns on, and what exactly does power mean? And perhaps that's maybe another part of the conversation. But briefly, I have always been a student of politics and how politics works. And essentially that's what I do. And when I look at politics, I'm talking politics 101, how does one person influence a relationship to the benefit of themselves or to others? And that's essentially what I do. So my background is I have a master's degree in political science and an unfinished doctorate that really needs to happen. And in terms of how we look at impacting legislative processes, I think it's important that we understand when we talk about racism, we're not just talking something that you can touch, you can feel, right? There's a polemic that is one de jure, meaning what happens on paper, what we see written, and de facto, what are the things that occur that either undermine what we think should happen in a very fair and equitable way, but this is the way things really are. So I try to use my own experiences, whether it's a lobbyist. I worked in the budget division as a fellow and as an intern for the governor's office. And I've also worked as, I was a graduate fellow for the New York State Black and Puerto Rican Caucus. And I've had to do this while working in environments that are typically Republican or Democrat, and how those things intersect. So briefly, that's what I do. I hope that answers the question.
It answers it answers the question very well, and it gives people some context into your world because it's related to higher education, but in a way that I don't even think most people realize is happening. So here's the question, all right? What does it mean to be actively anti-racist? And from your post in administration, right, what policies do you think have anti-racist tenets embedded in them with respect to Fordham University?
I think we need to step back for a second, because I don't think we actually adequately defined what racism is. And when you use the term anti-racist, I recognize that, okay, so a little bit about my background. I'm also a geek. I'm a political scientist by training. And while it's racial and gender politics specific, I also have a subfield in political philosophy. And when we're talking about anti-racism, we're of course building off the work of Dr. Kendi and Kimberly Crenshaw and the intersections of what these things mean. So when you talk about, and more specifically, one of the people I count as a mentor, Dr. Wilson, in talking about what racism is. So it is a critical term. So when we're talking about it, you have to talk about the structures that are in place. And what I mean by structures, you're not necessarily just talking things that are legal. It's a social contract that we're looking at. What are the things that we have ascribed to as a society when we talk about interactions with people and what makes a society the way it is? So when we look at racism, and in particular as it impacts African Americans and Black people, you have to look at what are the systemic things, what are the underlying things that we have all agreed to as part of our social contract. And part of those things is, one, when it comes to social contract as it pertains to African Americans, it means that, go back to slavery, the body of an African American is not necessarily their own. It can be controlled, it can be exploited, right? It could be used for the benefit of the society as a whole. Two, there are rights that the African American has that may not necessarily be warranted or protected by law. Look at our Supreme Court cases, right? The Dred Scott case. That specifically states that by law, African Americans do not have any rights or principles by which people need to address. So when you look at the contract, that's when you're able to understand, well, what exactly am I fighting against? Now, the anti-racist philosophy, and again, I don't know if racism is the whole term, because one can be racist without doing anything. So I've known people who are extremely pro-racist. They like it, and they're going to engage in policies and procedures and things that further a racist end. So to me, to be anti-racist, what you're looking at is, how does one actively go against the structures, implicit, explicit, against racism, race as a term itself. And that's a very difficult thing to do. From my perspective, in terms of where I sit in the university, my position is very much an external one, right? Very much looking at rules and laws and regulations as it pertains to not only higher education, but what society does as a whole. I am fortunate that in New York State, we at least have specific policies, right? Not just things written, but things that we're looking at that are affirmational as it pertains to particularly students of color. So for example, here in Fordham University, we are part of a program that's called the STEP and C-STEP program, right? It's a Collegiate Science and Technology Entry Program. It is a New York State funded program with the specific goal of increasing the number of students of color and women in fields, the health-related fields, the professions, science, technology, and the like. By engaging in that, and Fordham was the lead entity that actually convinced Governor Pataki's office, and who was a Republican, to double the amount of money in support of that program. Why? Now you're thinking, okay, wait a minute, this is someone, when you're thinking about political spectrum, why would they do this? And the fact is that when we are looking at politics, there is a relationship. I have to convince you to do something that you would not normally do underneath your own circumstances unless there's a self-interest. And the fact is that New York State at the time was losing a lot of STEM professionals to California, right? So investing a little bit of money in comparison to the larger New York State budget, right, into something like this as a policy objective, right, becomes programmatic. It's something that you can instill, you can put and make real at the university level. That's an example of something that, at least in terms of the university, that we participate in as a policy objective that is anti-racist, because you're looking at moving away something that is a structural inequity in the hopes of it moving forward. I hope that answers the question.
That answers the question beautifully, and it allows us to peer into your world because government relations is something that we should all know more about. And unfortunately, fortunately rather, we get to rely on your thinking at Fordham University. Kareem, I'd like to move to your question if we could, and then change this. There we go. So Kareem, brother, it is so good to see you again. Kareem schooled me in a meeting one time about Title IX, and I left knowing more about Title IX than I think I ever intended to know. The brother seriously knows his stuff, and he's got a powerful resume. At his core, he's an attorney. He attended law school at NYU. He's also got an MBA from Harvard. Kareem, can you tell us a little bit more about your professional work before I ask the next question?
Yeah, so I think MBA is on the mind, considering the context of this group, but
Yes.
it's only a master's in education with a focus in higher education from Harvard.
But Harvard, right?
Just a little bit about me. My name again is Kareem Pete. I am the university's Title IX coordinator. I oversee issues pertaining to sex and gender equity. And in my past, I've been a lead Title IX investigator, a deputy Title IX coordinator, and obviously I'm a Title IX coordinator as well. In a prior life, I was a general commercial litigator, and now I'm happy to be in this space working with brilliant, wonderful people. As was said, my education is what it is. I went to the schools, and I'm in the process of almost paying off all those loans. I love what I do because I'm a part of the modern civil rights movement. So it's a real treat and honor to get up every day and work remotely and maybe one day get back into the office.
Well, we're happy to have you and to be a part of that new movement with you, brother. So here's the question for you. There's been a huge surge in active anti-racist allyship. And so for our allies on the call, can you shed a little bit more light on what allyship is or what it looks like, and then how it works, and a few maybe best practices for our allies who are really seriously doing anti-racist work?
Yeah, so for all the allies on the call, thank you so much for all the work that you've been doing. And for the aspiring allies, or the people who aren't quite familiar with it, we'll just talk about that quickly. But the simple way of describing it is allyship is essentially a process for supporting or fighting for groups who are seeking equality or seeking access to certain spaces or certain resources, right? And as an ally, what sets that person apart or distinguishes that person is that they don't necessarily share the social identity, or they don't self-identify as a person who's in that group. So they're more playing a supportive role in this process for, again, fighting for equal rights, equal access, etc. So in terms of being an ally, there are, lots of great things that you can do, lots of ways to misstep. I guess the overarching concept is just do your best. Right? Be attentive, listen, and just try to in any way support the cause, right? So just naturally not self-identifying or not being in that group, in this case, race, will impact certain things in terms of your overall knowledge, etc. So there may be missteps, but the intent alone isn't enough, but having that spirit of wanting to be supportive and to be there is great. In terms of actual best practices, some of the ones that I would recommend are take some time to just take a breath, breathe in, and just think, what are my experiences and what are the experiences of other individuals? And what's the gap there? What don't I know? What don't I experience? And in that way, be understanding of that other group's experiences and understanding of what the struggle is, or the fight is, or the goal is, right? So that's commonly referred to as understanding your privilege. Privilege comes with it's a term that comes with a lot of different emotional ties to it, possibly. But again, understanding your privilege is just knowing what you know, what you experience, what you'll never experience, and understanding the experience of the individuals who are seeking, again, equality in some sense, and in this case, obviously being race. The other thing to do is listen. Ask questions of individuals in the group. And if you're uncomfortable doing that, one of my favorite things to do when I'm looking up certain issues with respect to LGBTQ plus rights or issues pertaining to different types of sexual violence, etc., if they're not an experience that I've had or a group that I'm in, YouTube. You can sit and talk to anyone or not. Well, it might be odd to talk to your screen, but to sit and listen to the experiences of other individuals and realize what they're going through. Also, another key issue is your role is to amplify voices, not to speak for other individuals. So again, just play a supportive role. And then the last thing I would say is, in any space, academic work, etc., be active, right? So you don't necessarily have to be at the forefront. You can be behind the scenes, but that includes speaking up, inviting people into spaces where they're not, or doing other various things. So just the key is to be active, and that can be, there are certain ways, that's where you get the language of co-conspirator or accomplice, right? So you can be very active or proactive, but also that opportunity to just let people into the space, or invite people into the space more appropriately, or, not sit around and say, oh, no one really heard it, or this doesn't really hurt anyone, but always, be present and be supportive. So that's and the last thing I would say is everyone makes mistakes. So just try to get back up, dust yourself off, learn the lessons, use the terminology that makes people comfortable, be in the spaces that people would like you to be in, and then just always keep moving forward. As with all things, it's a process.
Yeah, that's great. I think the best thing that you said out of all of the fantastic things that you said is it's really important to listen first before you start getting your hands dirty with the work. So thank you. I want to move now to Mandel Crawley. We're getting a little tight on time, but I want to make sure we've got everybody. All right, so Mandel, this is the first time that we are meeting in person. So first of all, just thank you so much for sharing space with us today. Brother Mandel is one of the most powerful Black people on Wall Street, and he is also one of the Gabelli School's own. He's an alum of GSV. He is also the managing director and the head of private wealth management for Morgan Stanley, which means that he and his team manage the ultra high wealth individuals, high net worth individuals for Morgan Stanley. Can you give us a little bit more context about your career and some of the financial umbrellas like under your department or your unit? And then from there, I'll ask the next question.
Sure. Thanks for having me. And I apologize to the Fordham family for the scare. I was trying to get in, 10, 15 minutes before the call, and I'm having all sorts of Wi-Fi issues here at home. So I apologize for that. But it's always good to be back with this family and Dean Repiccioli and crew. Again, it's good to see you. Look, I won't bore you guys with I won't get overly autobiographical here because I think folks have access to it. I'll just say that I've been at Morgan Stanley for almost 30 years. It's the only firm I've worked for. I started here when I was in high school. I've done a number of things across our ecosystem, sales and trading. I ran marketing for the firm. Now I run, as you mentioned, Clarence, the private wealth business, the international wealth business, sports and entertainment. And I oversee an institutional sales and trading business, and it's been fantastic. So thank you for having me, and I look forward to your next pitch.
We are just so happy to be on your schedule, sir. I can't say that enough. So here's the question, all right? Being in the finance industry, all right, you consume data on structural and systemic inequities and disparities all the time, all right? So when looking at systemic inequities, which one should really concern allies as they develop a deeper understanding of structural racism? And some of those policies can include anything that you've seen in some of the business dealings that you've had.
Yeah, look, it's a great question. I think some of your other panelists have already, hit on some of the themes. But if your question was a multiple choice question, and let's just say it had healthcare, criminal justice, education, income, wealth opportunities, et cetera, the answer to the question would be all of the above. Right, our entire social ecosystem has been impacted by systemic, oppressive, racist practices. Right, and that's been the case for several centuries. Right, 4 centuries to be exact. And that's not to say, right, for all the folks who are on the phone, that's not to say that we haven't had a lot of progress. I mean, I oftentimes talk about my grandfather. I was raised by my grandparents who were from the Jim Crow South. I mean, they were born and raised in the Mississippi Delta. left in the 1950s to go to Chicago, where they raised their children, and ultimately, I have the optionality that I have because of the sacrifices that they made. But when I think about my granddad and the choices that he had in front of him, whether it was educational or professional, and I think about what I've been able to do, without question, we've made some progress, but that doesn't mean that we've achieved equality. And so across every single one of those verticals, Clarence, we still have a great deal of issues. And so I like to think about this in the context of it's a belief system. The challenge with systemic racism is nobody owns it, right? It's our customs, right? And it's embedded in every single thing that we do. And it's a result of the cumulative compounding effect that goes way back to slavery. So start at 1619 and work your way backwards. It continues to be a real issue. And I think the best way to describe it for all the allies who are on the phone, the best example that I think I'll give is when you think about the opioid crisis that the country is grappling with, and it's being treated appropriately like a health crisis. But it's an issue that largely impacts our white fellow citizens. And when you juxtapose that, or you compare that to the so-called war on drugs that started, I think it started to get momentum under Nixon in the 60s, but obviously has run through both Republican and Democratic administrations over the last 4 or 5 decades. And you think about how they treated Black and brown families, right, who had, I'm not talking about the pushers, I'm talking about the users, and how many families got ripped apart, right, as a result of the criminalization of drug use. That gives you a tangible example of, in my view, systemic racism. And again, it runs through the entire ecosystem. And I'm more than happy, if time permits, to get into some of the policies from a financial services perspective, things like redlining and other oppressive policies, but I'll stop there just in the spirit of brevity.
No, I think that is fantastic. I've been scared to say that I've noticed the differences in how we treat the opioid epidemic as opposed to how we treated maybe like the crack epidemic in the 80s and in the early 90s.
Sure.
And it seems like, it's treated differently because the victims of both they look different, right? Thank you, Mandel. Fantastic. Okay, so I'd like to go now to Ashley, and then we're going to field a few questions from the audience, all right? So, Dr. Ashley Davis, it is so good to see you again. Huge question for you. Are you taking any new clients, Dr. Davis? Because I think I need to sit on your couch and talk about my pandemic trauma, right?
There's so much happening right now. Yes.
So much is going on right now. So Dr. Davis is a licensed clinical psychologist in both the state of New York and also in the state of Maryland. Her research interests are focused on, this is pretty fascinating, gendered racial stereotypes and also stress and coping. And those are just a few of her research interests. She has many, all right? Ashley, can you tell us just a little bit more about your career from a psychological perspective? And then I'll ask your question.
Yes,
right?
so absolutely. So I'm a supervising psychologist and a coordinator for diversity, inclusion, and social justice initiatives at the Rose Hill campus here at Fordham. I've been with Fordham now for 10 months, so sort of approaching this year mark, and it's been lovely. So within capacity of my role, I work primarily with students of color. So that's what my caseload primarily consists of. I do individual therapy, group therapy. So I have a women of color group. In light of all that's been happening recently, sociopolitically, with the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, I now have a Black healing and empowerment circle specifically for Black students to sort of process, different emotions that come up for them in a supportive and affirming environment. I also do a lot of outreach. So I work pretty closely with C-STEP and, also Office of Multicultural Affairs, Chief Diversity Office. And I also work collaboratively with students. For instance, about maybe 8 months ago, the Community Student Association invited me to speak about ways to manage stress. And it was called Taco About Stress. And they served tacos to the students. So I think that was pretty cool. So, again, that's what I do at Fordham. I also have a private practice. I'm licensed in New York and Maryland. My private practice is right now all virtual in light of COVID. In terms of my background, so yes, counseling psychology, my PhD, I did my postdoc at Columbia, and that's a nice synopsis, I think.
That is great, and we are so lucky to have you because we don't focus on our mental health as much as we should, and so it's important to recognize the trauma of this work. I think that's a really good segue into the question here, which is, let's see, people are doing a lot more critical anti-racist work that is often related to racism and trauma. Is racism traumatic? And if so, what are the implications as it relates to mental health?
Absolutely. So I have a few slides prepared. If we could just sort of go to the next one, that would be fantastic. Absolutely. Okay, so racial trauma, yes, it is a thing, right? And that really speaks to why, in doing anti-racist work, how we're all interconnected and how it's so necessary. So we need those who are doing philanthropy, we need those who are within the school systems, we need those who are able to do the type of work, the research to validate, yes, this is a real and valid experience, especially given the context and idea of a post-racial society. So racial trauma is a form of race-based stress, which refers to the reactions to dangerous events and real or perceived experiences of racial discrimination by people of color and indigenous individuals, okay? So, you know, this includes threats of harm and injury, humiliating and shaming events, and witnessing harm to other people of color. So even if, you know, you're not experiencing something directly, there's a vicarious trauma experience and seeing people who look like you having a knee on their neck and so on, or seeing somebody shot to the ground like a dog, and these things that are happening. So it reflects, you know, a racial trauma, vicarious traumatic experience. Racial trauma also reflects the cumulative effects of racism on an individual's mental and physical health, and is linked to anxiety, depression, suicidality, and other physical health issues. So in thinking about this, so Dr. Derald Wing Sue, he's a faculty member in counseling psychology at Columbia. He described microaggressions as comprised of 3 factors: micro invalidations, micro insults, and micro assaults. So the micro insults would be a comment like something overt, like a micro assault would be more overt, like, why don't you go back to Africa or something like that. And it's very intentional. But regardless of intent, the impact is still harmful. So that's something that we have to be mindful of. So a micro insult would be something like, wow, you're so articulate. I had somebody tell me that once after I gave a presentation. I'm like, I'm a PhD student at that time. How would you expect me to give a presentation? I was a little taken aback by that. And that's what I mean when I say these experiences, even if they seem, you know, more trivial, more minimal, it results in racial trauma based on the cumulative effects of these things happening on a daily. And then finally, the most insidious of them all are the micro-invalidations, because that's the one in which the daily lived experiences of people of color are invalidated. So for instance, you're being a little sensitive, aren't you? You know, just really invalidating the experiences of being marginalized, experiences of being excluded, the experiences of being silenced. So that's what's meant by micro-insults, assaults, and invalidations, and they very much have significant effect on mental health. You know, people of color experiencing a heightened anxiety, especially now with all that's happening, being at the forefront. Depressive symptoms, you know, suicidal ideation, and the somatic piece is very important. So a lot of times people of color experience emotional disturbances somatically, meaning in the body. So it can look like headaches. Oh my gosh, my head is hurting. Muscle tension, the back is hurting. And when this is a more pervasive issue that's not being addressed, emotions that aren't really processed and worked through, there's not really support, you know, and being attuned to these needs and these experiences, it becomes more serious as a result of a suppressed immune system. So like hypertension, which is very pervasive in our communities, okay? Diabetes and other more serious ailments.
Right.
So if you could go to the next one. So in terms of racial trauma, so it's historical or multi-generational trauma that's happening across the generations. Post-traumatic slave syndrome particularly, and the trauma of colonization leave lasting psychological scars on people of color across the generations. The traumas of our communal and familial ancestors are inherited. So that's what's meant by epigenetics. You know, the idea of us inheriting trauma, even if we didn't experience something directly. And this contributes to the distress we experience today. So reflective within post-traumatic slave syndrome is a diminished sense of self-worth, okay? An ever-present anger and racist socialization, which oftentimes looks like internalized racism towards self as well as towards others. So with the diminished self-worth, when you think about slavery, right? You know, it wasn't just the chattel slavery where, aside from serfdom, you know, it's like, okay, you're enslaved African, your child's enslaved African, but it was the warfare that was happening in addition to. So in addition to the police brutality and the subpar treatment, to say the least, there was also the cultural destruction, you know, the loss of heritage, the loss of language, the imposed identity, the loss of customs and so on, but also the divide and conquer strategy that was implemented, which is very much still an issue today, because they put the darker skinned Africans against the lighter skinned Africans, who was in the field, who was in the house, and so on. And now this is reflected within colorism, who's dark skinned, who's light skinned, and even a lot of elitism and classism within our community, rather than us sort of embracing more of a unified front. The collective trauma. So racial trauma not only affects us at the individual level, but also the collective level. White supremacy is maintained by an intentional oppressive strategy to foster splintering between communities of color in an attempt to ensure that there's no unification and solidarity to gain collective power, okay? So collective trauma manifests between communities of color in these ways: competition and mistrust between different groups, different communities of color, beliefs of, a racialized stratification or hierarchy, usually with those with more proximity to whiteness being at the top, those who are lighter skinned, and so on. And colorism within and across the groups. So there's that. And then in terms of PTSD symptoms in everyday life, right? So post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, it looks like increased vigilance and suspicion. So, and this can be harmful, like, well, what did that person mean by that? Just like ruminating about it and so on, just increased vigilance and suspicion, increased sensitivity to threat, increased psychological and physiological symptoms, so a lot of bodily reactions because the body keeps the score, increased isolation, increased alcohol and drug usage, increased self or other aggression, as well as a narrowing sense of time. Okay, so in terms of that increased self or other aggression, so a lot of anger turned inward, as well as, some harm being acted within the community as a result of trauma.
Right. I think that is fantastic. I'm not cutting you off at all, am I?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Okay, all right, just making sure. All right, so I'd love to come back to this, because I think whether or not you're black or white or green or purple, all of the physical things that can happen to your body as it relates to stress, right? It's something, it's a conversation we really have to have. So I'd like to come back to this. Let's put a pin in it. We're getting some questions from our audience, and I just want to make sure that we can ask those questions. So the first question that I have, and this is for anybody who'd like to answer the question, is what can faculty do, I assume at the Gabelli School of Business and also at Fordham University, to be better allies in and outside of the classroom? Is the rest of the question. I personally try my best, but I feel like I could do more, and I'd like to know how. And this is from Professor Sertan Kabadahi.
Okay. I think probably one of the first things that faculty members can do to be better allies is to understand your position of power, right? You have the capacity to be able to affect someone's academic career. And students know that, right? Black, white, brown, doesn't matter. You have the capacity to do that. As such, if you're looking at a university that is considered a majority white campus, and you have a student population of students of color who simply are not the majority, I think what sometimes happens is that in the effort to try to connect, it is done in a way that can be offensive. And it's offensive because sometimes what happens is that in the effort to try to connect, you sometimes put students of color in the position of having to either defend their experience, explain their experience, or become the embodiment of that experience for everyone else, right? So now all of a sudden, if you're having a conversation about race, and it becomes racialized, and if you're the only student of color in that room, it's the natural tendency in some cases, and it should not be natural, but there may be the tendency to say, hey, look, from my side of the room, I'm looking to try to validate you and your experience, right? But you're talking to an 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old. And now you're expecting that person to answer the question to validate their own lived experience. And if they don't do it in such a way, these are the eggshells, right? That all students have to walk on, right? If I don't answer a question a certain way, how does this impact my grade?
Right.
Add to that the isms or the embodiment of that person, whether it's race, gender, what have you. And now they're being expected to be the person, the expert in that room. It's traumatic. And I think if faculty members, especially since you're at a university, right? If you want to know what's going on within certain communities, there is an African American Studies department, right? You have one of the best libraries in the country. You have experts across not only this institution, but other institutions. So I think before we come back to the classroom setting, whenever that happens, COVID-19 be damned, this is an opportunity to say, hey, look, how can I take what it is that I'm doing, value each student as being students, right, and their own lived experience, and not unnecessarily place trauma or place pressure on students who are already going through the experience of most students, most African and Latino American students, if you look at their numbers, come from predominantly Latino, Black institutions. And then you put them on a campus where it's predominantly white. So that is already a culture shock you're having right there. Add to that the pressure. So I would think that would be one of I think for, if in answering the question, to be a better ally is to better understand the pressures of students of color when they're entering this environment and the expectations that you place on them that might be unnecessary. I hope that helps.
May I add
Yeah,
one
that's
thing?
excellent. Yes, please.
The one thing I would say from the sex and gender sphere world, one for advocates, one of the simple questions they give to people who are nervous about going into the advocacy world, going into emergency departments, etc., is how are you doing, right? So if you want to know how people are doing, you want to know how to help people or assist people or be supportive or find out if you're on the right path. How are you doing from the people that you're concerned about? That's a very easy one. One from the Title IX, where we're neutral or impartial. Are you comfortable saying a little bit about your experience? Are you comfortable saying a little bit about how your day's going? Right? If you want to know how to help people or how to assist people or how to support people, again, listening and finding out what they're up to, what they're thinking about, what their concern is. If, we may or may not get to the intersectionality issue later on, but, maybe people of color are concerned with their economic position right now. Right? Obviously, wealth or lack thereof isn't a race issue, although there are correlations, etc. But you'll find out that that's the concern, right? Access to education is their concern. It might not be, will I be allowed to enter this restaurant and sit at the counter?
Yeah, that's perfect. I'm gonna go to the next question from the chat, and then we'll go back into the other questions. Okay. So this one is for Mandel. It says that Mr. Crawley, what have you done to combat diversity issues at Morgan Stanley as the head of private wealth management prior to the George Floyd situation and then also after?
Look, it's a great question. I don't think there's any financial institution that can declare victory, frankly. I think if you go across various industries, I think one of the things that we're seeing is everyone is still grappling with this thing called progress. But for me specifically, I mean, I have a platform inside my firm that requires me to do a number of things. Number one, be appropriately edgy on this topic and ensuring that the culture of the organization is intentional around changing the makeup of our talent. Like that's one aspect of the job. The other is having some influence as it relates to folks who are managing capital, getting them access to our platform. We happen to be the largest retail distributor in the country, and having more folks of color, on that platform and having that access to influence that. Another dimension is obviously working with all of the different vendors that we spend our dollars with, and having a real disciplined approach to what they call supplier diversity, and not just the low margin business, but some of the higher margin business in terms of lawyers, attorneys, accountants, et cetera. Folks who we work with or whatnot. So I would say if you look at our performance, right, on an absolute basis, right? You just zoom out and you just say, okay, how diverse is Morgan Stanley? You just look at the denominator of 60,000 employees, and then you look at the numerator, you probably would conclude that, wow, they got a lot of work to do, and you would be correct. But if you were to start to look at how we performed over the last 5 years, or how we performed over the last 10 years in terms of the number of Black managing directors that we have today versus what we had, 10 years ago, you'd be pretty impressed by the growth rate. If you looked at the percentage of Black and brown analysts that we have in our firm today versus the percentage that we had, 5 or 10 years ago, again, you say they're making progress. So long story short, we've done better, but there's still a heck of a lot of work to be done. I spend a ton of time mentoring, but more than mentoring, I spend a ton of time sponsoring, Black folks that come into Morgan Stanley, and obviously some of them ultimately leave, but they're still very much a part of my network, and it's something I take a great deal of pride in doing. So long-winded way of saying no one can declare that they've done enough. The reality is there's no finish line when it comes to this work. My firm is no different. I'm no different, but I'm pretty pleased with the level of intentionality, both pre and post the tragic events surrounding Brother Floyd.
Thank you very much, Mandel. That is awesome. We're going to continue to field a few questions from the chat, but I want to get back into the questions that we have that are prepared. We will call this the lightning round, where we try our best to stick to 2 to 3 minutes for our questions, because we want to make sure we get through all of them. All right. So we'll go right down to Leslie, and if we could skip ahead to her slide. So Leslie, question really quickly. Oftentimes when discussing racism, all right, the burden is on people of color to lead the conversation, and to do so in a way that doesn't alienate or cause harm to anyone, but normally the majority. Can you speak to how difficult it is to deal with trauma while walking on eggshells?
I have 2 minutes? Okay.
I'm so
okay, so I think the short version of this is being able to put this in a way that folks would understand completely.
Mm-hmm.
Take race out of this for a second, right? The nature of what I do is about the building of securing of relationships, right? Political relationships. And if I'm looking at politics as the ability of person A to make person B do something that person B would not normally be able to do without some form of self-benefit or self-interest, that's a relationship, right? So let's say you and I are in a relationship, make it romantic, right? And this relationship means something, at least we think it means something. And in the nature of that relationship, I come to you with a complaint. You're always late. You always do this. You don't do this, blah, blah, blah. I tell you what my feelings are. And if the automatic response that I have to do now is to say, before I tell you how I feel, I now have to couch it in such a way that you hear me or that it doesn't hurt your feelings. That means I spend an inordinate amount of time catering to you and your feelings versus trying to get my feelings out, acknowledging what my feelings are. Worse yet, if I tell you what my feelings are, you can have several responses. First response might simply be, hey, look, you know what? I didn't know I did that. I didn't know I did not know I did that, and I apologize. But more importantly, if you want to make this relationship better, hey, what can I do to be better in this? If you tell me, however, that it's all in my mind, you know, is there something going on with you? I don't think what you're saying is true. Then you've just invalidated my feelings. If I'm not going to tolerate that in a romantic relationship, a personal one-on-one relationship, why am I obligated to tolerate it when I deal in my professional setting? When I now talk about race, and I tell you that this is an issue. And if your response is you're not willing to listen, you're looking to put the blame on me, or if I now have to spend more time making you feel better about what it is that you may or may not be doing, then why am I having the conversation with you in the first place? If you're not willing to go through all those iterations just to get, you know, some biscuits at Red Lobster, then why should I go through this on in my own professional lived experience? Am I in 2 minutes?
No, you're great. That's perfect. So thank you, by the way. And I've got a lot of things going on. The chat is coming. Okay, so Mandel, you were going to have our next stock question, and we also have a new question that's come through for you on the chat. Would you like the stock question or the chat question? I think the chat question might be better suited. Which one would you like?
Let's go with the chat. Let's give the people
Okay.
what they want.
Let's give the people what they want. I'm with it. Okay, so Mr. Crawley, on a macro level, what recommendations can you offer for a college to support its faculty and students as an institutional manifestation of allyship? Our students will be your future employees or colleagues. How would you like for them to walk into your office space?
So look, I think that there are three things that immediately come to mind in terms of what Fordham can do, and I'll just keep it at the broader level. Number one is the talent, the people, right? The people is always the main thing, and I think the university has been doing a much better job at bringing in diverse talent. But again, as I said, even as it relates to my own firm, we all still have more work to do, and we can all do a better job on that front. So I think just continuing to be incredibly intentional about bringing in Black talent, into the university, onto our campuses, and having them have the opportunity to leverage, the infrastructure that all of us as panelists on this call have been able to leverage, I think will be a great thing. So that's number one. Number two, I would encourage the university to get proximate to our communities. Now, obviously having the good fortune of being in the Bronx, some of that is relatively easy, but again, I still think that more can be and should be done on that front. I think the reality is, when folks want to learn more about the lived experiences, doing it from the couch, the proverbial couch or the actual couch, is not the way to do it, or doing it through whether it's CNN, MSNBC, or Fox News is not the way to do it. I think you actually have to get in the community and work, side by side, with the communities of color, whether it's through philanthropic means. Obviously, Fordham has a pretty good endowment, through our philanthropic efforts. I think that there are ways in which to do it. So that would be the second bucket. And the third bucket, which has been talked about here, is just through education. And whether it's in the four walls, the proverbial walls of the university, or there's so many other resources that are out there. It's been mentioned, from YouTube to Netflix to podcasts to, there's no shortage of content that's out there. And the thing that I think is most important for our allies is, once you actually go into the deep waters of our history, right? Once you peel back the real scar tissue, because we love to romanticize the narrative of our country, right? And I get it, right? We founded on some incredibly aspirational ideals. But when you go into the deep waters, it will absolutely break your heart, right? And once your heart gets broken, that is going to be an incredible catalyst for you to want to do better on some of these things that we've talked about. But before you can lead, you have to learn. And so I would encourage and implore everybody to just take the time, their own time, to immerse themselves in some of the suggestions that have been made by the panelists here, and just get better educated on the history of the country and why we are where we are. Because frankly, if you do that, you will not be surprised at some of the output, right, that exists across our society, because the system was actually designed to do exactly what it's done. So those are the things that immediately come to mind for me. Is, let's be intentional about who we're bringing into the university. Let's be more aggressive in terms of some of our diverse candidacy, and so put some real targets out there, right? I don't know what the latest percentages are, but let's have some aspiration to double that number over a 5-year, 10-year period of time. I mean, John F. Kennedy said in 1960 he wanted to put a man on the moon. That didn't come to fruition until 1969. So some of this is aspirational, but I'd love to see the university get more aggressive in terms of what we would like to see from a diversity perspective over the next 5-10 years.
Thank you, Mandel. I'd like to follow up that conversation offline, maybe about potential internships, if we can get the students in. So what does the career pipeline look like after they graduate?
Sure.
That's a separate conversation.
And I missed that piece. I mean, I'll tell you, Morgan Stanley, we've got an incredibly, and Dean Rappacioli knows this, we've got a great, very vibrant Fordham alumni community at the institution. The general counsel of Morgan Stanley is a proud alum. My boss is a Fordham alum. The guy who works for me runs our New York office is a Fordham alum. So we got plenty of Rams running around our ecosystem. So I'm actually pretty pleased with where we are. But again, there's still more for us to do on that front, and I'll definitely be doing my part there.
All right, thank you so much, Mandel. Let's go now to the next slide, and it'll be Ashley again. So Ashley, in our lightning round, this is your question. Conversations about race normally bring up a lot of emotions. How do you suggest that people of color and also our allies deal with or cope with anti-Blackness and racial trauma? And what are some of the best practice on how to keep our mental health intact?
You're muted, Ashley.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I have a few slides. If you could just go forward a little bit. Okay, so in terms of stress and coping, one way to cope with the very real racial trauma that's happening on a daily, there are a number of resources. So one is the 24/7 crisis text line for people of color. If you text Steve to 741-741, if you don't feel like talking, just rather receive support while in distress in the moment. There are clinicians, licensed clinicians who are trained to deal with, cultural concerns and issues of oppression. So that's one resource. Another thing is mindfulness. So just the idea of being present, centered in the here and now. Oftentimes when we find ourselves overwhelmed with anxiety, it's that we're in a future-oriented sense about what will happen or could happen. Conversely, if we're ruminating about a past-oriented concern, something that happened yesterday or last week or last year, the emotions become overwhelming, they're oftentimes depressive symptoms. So in those instances, when we find ourselves overwhelmed with emotion, it's helpful to take a break via mindfulness. So being in the here and now, namely with the 5 senses. So just being present, with a tactile sensation, like a heating pad or, using ice on your hand, just as a means to sort of distract oneself. A stress ball is a tactile sensation in terms of sound, right? So listening to a soothing song, in terms of a visual, watching a soothing video or an empowering video. In terms of scent, there's like the aroma diffusers that you can get from Walmart, and they have the different scents as a means of being mindfulness to sort of regulate what's happening emotionally, okay? Right. You can burn incense, that's another one, right? A favorite perfume.
They're gonna put me out of Hughes Hall when I put all this stuff in my, I'm joking with you, go ahead.
But yes, these are some ways to be mindful and to sort of regulate what's happening emotionally. In terms of taste, if there's a delicious meal that you like, to eat it, not in a way where it's fast. We're in such a society where everything is so fast paced. You eat, we wolf it down, move to the next thing, but rather being mindful in how we're eating it, being present with the, the texture of the meal and all the different, seasonings in it and so on. So as a great way to be mindful. So another thing is community. I can't stress that enough. Community and solidarity is incredibly important. So find your people. And navigating oppression, it's important to, self-validate despite all the recurring cues in the environment around anti-intellectualism and inferiority. So self-validation is important. Extended self-identity, right? So I exist, because you exist, right? The whole idea of like a collective work and responsibility, like Ujima. So just find your people, basically. Continue to resist the oppression, challenge the status quo, to be conscious that we're not internalizing it. And then finally, self-care. Self-care is so important. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But there's the Black Lives Matter meditation for healing racial trauma. So specifically for that, if you could just Google it, it's like 20 minutes long. It's a nice, beautiful meditation for that. And then Liberate, which is the only meditation app by and for the Black, Indigenous, and people of color community. I'd encourage you to look that one up too. It's really helpful. So then there's optimal theory. So optimal theory, and I'm mindful of the time, so I won't take too long. But optimal theory by Dr. Linda Myers is an Afrocentric framework for optimal functioning. Okay, and it basically lists 6 tenets as necessary for optimal functioning for individuals across the African diaspora, particularly. That's the framework from which it was developed, but also more generally. And it really pushes the tenets of self-knowledge, extended self-identity, diunidal logic, okay, with self-knowledge being the process of gaining a deeper understanding of the self. So self-insight, not even just within the context of understanding one's thought processes and how childhood experiences factor into that, understanding one's needs and so on, and clarifying one's values, but also understanding one's heritage, what's one's true heritage. as a means towards optimal functioning and being well. Then the extended self-identity piece that I already talked to you about. So self in relation to others is the focus of the individual experience. All right, there's a highest value placed on interpersonal relationships and repairing relationships. It's a sense of self-extended nature and time, including all of the ancestors, those who aren't born yet, right, all of nature. So just a sense of interconnectedness in a nutshell. Okay, and understanding the responsibility that one has to the self, to others, and generations to come. Okay, and then diurnal logic is just the idea, it's the union of opposites. So taking a both and approach and understanding situations. So it's more like a cognitive piece of, you know, a balance. Then there's intrinsic self-worth, spiritual development, and a holistic worldview. So an intrinsic self-worth, the notion that we're valuable because we exist, that we have a divine nature, and so on. The spiritual development is something that's necessary, understanding that we exist in a context greater than ourselves. So really affirming connection to the transcendent, to God, to the divine. And finally, a holistic worldview. So just the idea that to be healthy is to be attuned to our holistic needs. So not just the physical needs, you know, like food, water, and things like that, but spiritual needs, emotional needs, psychological needs, and just being attuned to those needs holistically, to answer you.
Yeah, that's perfect, Ashley. Thank you. This is another good conversation that I'd like to continue offline, because I really think I need a seat on your couch. On your couch. Let's see, Bliss, we're gonna go to you for the next question. So I think your slide might be 1 or 2 over. Let's see, Bliss, there you go. In your career as a DEI practitioner, all right, you're probably bombarded with a variety of cases, tasks, and deliverables on a day-to-day. Which policies are the hardest to reinforce in your population at the Actors Equity Association?
So that's an interesting question, and I think it has to be really contextualized with the fact that that we're a labor union, right? So a lot of the improvements that we can make for our members have to be bargained for with employers. It also, I think, is important to contextualize it with the context of the theater industry. It is one in which people are very transient, right? But they also have a deep sense that they, as a community, are among the most inclusive people you ever want to meet. Right. So it's very, very common for people, particularly in the theater branch of entertainment, to respond to any conversation about inequity of any sort, but particularly racial inequity with, like, you know, we're the most inclusive industry there is. So one of the major hurdles for me as I offer producer, employer-facing resources is getting them beyond the notion that just because we're entertainers and, you know, all the geeks come and play with us and we're a total family and the show must go on, that doesn't exempt you from this national conversation that we're having about racial inclusion. So I would say one of my biggest hurdles is getting industry leaders to identify that their sense of themselves is very different from what the data suggests about them in terms of programming, how inclusive that is, in terms of hiring, not only for actors and stage managers who come and go quite a bit, but for their long-term at-will employees, and in terms of the kinds of complaints that are elevated to the union. The numbers are, I think tragic is a fair word, but getting people beyond the sense of, but we're the kind of people you ever want to meet is difficult for me. Another challenge, very briefly, another challenge that I have with employers and producers is getting them to be willing to agree contractually to investing any resource toward anti-racist work. Everyone is very, very excited to look at more and more robust, general, non-discriminatory language. But when the conversation narrows to, this is a common practice that is discriminatory. For instance, skin parts is a major win that we had recently. It's traumatic for actors to have types or costume pieces that are meant to replicate the wearer's skin tone that don't match them. You're the one brown person in an ensemble of 20 people, and everyone else's shoes and tights match their skin, and you have this weird gray peach thing that doesn't match. They're not willing to acknowledge the literal reality of your color in the costuming process. We have been able to get producers to contractually agree to make sure that skin parts match the skin tone and color of the wearer. But that's an investment of maybe $20 per person. When we start talking about larger things, like it's discriminatory that you've hired an entire hair and makeup staff that does not know how to do black hair or makeup, and we ask them to agree to that, they have trouble there. So anyway.
No, that's perfect. No, that's perfect. I just want to really quickly get to the last question, and then if we have time, one or two more from the chat. All right. So Kareem, you're the last question. As a Title IX coordinator for the university, you have to deal with intersectionality in ways that most of us do not. Do you mind defining the term intersectionality and telling us how it works, both the worlds of DEI and intersectionality and how they collide in your work? Next slide, please.
It's easier to answer this question when I'm not muted. So the best way to describe intersectionality is to think of it more as a framework that helps people understand how the many forms of discrimination or oppression or marginalization come together and impact people, right? And in understanding the intersectionality issues, we understand how the combination of various identities may lead to different outcomes if you were just in one group or just in another group, right? So the core issue there is, as with all things, education, business, etc., just looking at things in silos may not address the true needs of individuals. So in terms of Title IX work, in terms of DEI work, intersectionality is a key issue. So specifically for Title IX, for example, we see that marginalized groups, certain groups do not come forward to share their experiences due to the fact that the community is so small that essentially reporting is to make a public report to the entire community. Right. And we see other issues, individuals who, again, and this is the Title IX space, if there's a group of individuals who participate in, say, like kink or something along those lines, or BDSM or something along those lines, those groups, again, the way that society views them or treats them puts them in a space that marginalizes them, that pushes them to the outside of the norm, or they don't feel comfortable accessing the community's resources. And then you layer on that race, you layer on that religion, you layer age, etc. And then you start seeing things compound and take new forms that you don't necessarily get if you address race individually, address sex, gender identities individually, etc. So the long story short is, it's key to understanding the multiple identities that people have in order to address to pull the correct levers, or to understand the confluence of factors that has brought them to where they are today.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. I think intersectionality is really important in the sense that we'd like to the extent that we can, just acknowledge everybody's difference, right? So let's see.
The other thing on top of that is that everyone can be an ally. No one is all things. So that, we all can step up, be supportive, for groups. We don't have to represent everything, and it's, you know, literally impossible.
Okay. Yes, it is. It is absolutely possible. All right. Let's see. I've got a few questions from the chat. Mandel has to jump off. He's certainly extremely busy. We've only got about 10 more minutes here. So let me ask this question. I'd like to think that I have been attentive to the issues of racism in our country, but I continue to learn things like the series on Reconstruction by Dr. Henry Louis Gates that was on PBS last year. At this moment, which many of us hope will be the beginning of a positively transformational era for our country and world as we move forward, how important is an accurate understanding of the past? I'll take the question. So it's really important to understand history because it repeats itself. So without having a really clear understanding of the history of racism in this country, it's really difficult to see how the policies from not just slavery until now, but even before, going back to indentured servitude before, like when the colonists first got here, from the 15 to the 1600s, and then from there into slavery and the Reconstruction, and then Jim Crow laws and so on and so forth, criminalization of drugs, until we are here where policing has gotten out of hand. And if you don't know the origins of policing, then it is a shot in the dark to think that you can solve a 400-year-old issue without some context of the history. All right. I think that's our last audience question, and that's a good thing because I'm going to ask this last question to everyone. And that question is, in your own words, what do you think the revolution should look like? And how can the Gabelli School of Business aid in the mission of the revolution? And if you're confused at all about what the revolution means, the revolution for us has always been equity. Okay. All right. So please answer the question. Anyone who would like to?
May I, as a very recent student and a current student next door, I really want to amplify something that Leslie said earlier. From a student's point of view, the revolution would be taking an enormous step forward if professors not only identified their power in our dynamic, but took bold responsibility for understanding that race is always in the room. It doesn't matter how quant the thing you're teaching is, race probably has some effect on it. And in terms of delivering students to the world, someone asked, how do you want students to come into our organization? If the perfect revolution for me is one in which professors take responsibility for owning how this subject ties to their subject, so that we can go into the world unscathed by our experiences in university.
That's beautiful. Would anybody else like to tackle the question?
For me personally, I was actually having this conversation with my cousins a few weeks ago.
Of course, we're all having this
generally, and in the like roundabout way that we talk about things. So it was the you know, being really like being healthy and being active in this era where you're just sitting in like one space all the time and not moving and not walking for lunch. And I think one way to promote the revolution, to really bring about change, is just consistency. It is insanely difficult, or incredibly difficult, to appear in the same space every day like clockwork with the same values and intention and purpose. So yes, there are great things that you see on TV. You know, shout out to Avengers Endgame or Infinity War, right? In an hour and a half to 2.5 hours or whatever that was, you'll, see so much. But sometimes it is just an hour a day, 4 hours a day, whatever it may be, having your voice be heard, reflecting the change that you want to see out there, and just moving forward one step after another, left foot, right foot, as I often say.
I think that is fantastic.
Yeah.
I see another question in the chat. I don't quite know if we have time because we only, oh, did you want to answer the same question, Leslie? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Yes, please. Okay. Yeah,
uh,
1 to 2 minutes. Go ahead.
Sure. I think Gil Scott Heron said it best. The revolution will not be televised.
Amen.
And the idea is that if we're looking to make significant change, it can't be performative. And there's a tendency that when these things happen, right, it seems like there's these conversations get held, book clubs start forming, and so we start talking about it, and we start thinking, especially being at a Jesuit university, there is a moral obligation, I think, beyond being performative. So if we're going to really talk about this, it means you have to be actively doing something. What does that mean? It means making sure that if being a racial ally is important, it means we have to talk about, not just talk about it, how do we come up with strategies for increasing the number of students, faculty, and staff of color on this campus? How do we ensure that pipelines exist that when our students graduate, that there are jobs waiting for them? How do we maximize the relationships that we build? And I put myself into this category. One of the questions that came up was about internships. I've put more students in internships on the city, state, federal level than anything. So if you want an internship in government, email me.
We will.
And we can talk about that. But
We absolutely will.
But we can't just talk about this. And there has to be timelines. If you say you're going to do something, put a timeline to it. So that means people can hold you accountable. And this is not just for Gabelli. This is for everyone. If you're seeing yourself as an ally, don't let the revolution be televised.
Beautiful, Les. I could not have put it better myself. I'd like to thank everybody for being here, but of course I'm going to give the last words to the Dean. So Dean Repetoli, please take it away.
This was incredible. Thank you so much for sharing your personal experiences and great tips. I was taking notes. I have a bunch of things that I definitely want to follow up on. And hopefully we'll be able to do this again. I don't want this to just be a one-off. So thank you all. And thank you to the audience for participating. We look forward to the continued conversation.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye, you guys.